我宣布
The 9,118th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Afghanistan. The agenda is adopted.
按照安理会
In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Pakistan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided.
那两个就不需要。
For the other two countries, Iran and
按照安理会
In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffith, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Mr. Marcus Potzel, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan. And Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards, Independent Researcher and Author. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffith.
Thanks very much indeed, Mr. President. The people in Afghanistan continue to face extreme hardship and uncertainty. And let me share some numbers with you. Close to 19 million people are facing acute levels of food insecurity, including 6 million people at risk of famine. More than half of the population, some 24 million people, need humanitarian assistance, and an estimated 3 million children are acutely malnourished. They include over 1 million children estimated to be suffering from the most severe, life-threatening form of malnutrition. Without specialized treatment, these children could die. This malnutrition crisis is fueled by recurrent drought, including the worst in 3 decades in 2021, and whose effects are still lingering. 8 out of 10 Afghans drink contaminated water, making them susceptible to repeated bouts of acute watery diarrhea. Around 25 million people are now living in poverty, and 3/4 of people's income is spent on food. There's been a 50% decline in households receiving remittances. Unemployment could reach 40%, and inflation is rising due to increased global prices, import constraints, and currency depreciation. So these relentless layers of crisis persist at a time when communities are already struggling. In June, a 5.9 magnitude earthquake affected over 360,000 people living in high-intensity areas, impact areas. And since July, heavy rains have led to massive flash floods across the country and indeed the region, killing and injuring hundreds of people, destroying thousands of homes, as well as thousands of acres of crops. Afghanistan has also witnessed unprecedented levels of internal displacement and population movement. Some 5.8 million people remain in protracted internal displacement, requiring long-term solutions. So these are the figures, Mr. President, and they're devastating, and frankly, they're difficult to comprehend. We worry that they will soon become worse. Once the cold weather sets in, food and fuel prices, already high, will skyrocket, and families will have to choose between feeding their children, sending them to school, taking them to a doctor when they fall sick, or keeping them warm. Mr. President, Afghanistan's problems are unfortunately neither new nor unique. Conflict, poverty, climate shocks, food insecurity have long been a sad reality for Afghanistan and for many other countries around the world. But let me outline what makes Afghanistan's current situation so critical. Large-scale development assistance has been halted for a year. Before the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan was already facing severe levels of food insecurity and malnutrition, and these levels have, of course, deteriorated since development aid was halted, affecting families everywhere, from rural communities to urban centers. The operating environment, second point, is extremely challenging. Engaging with the de facto authorities at national and subnational levels is labor-intensive. There's no confidence in the domestic banking sector, heading to a severe liquidity crisis. International financial transactions are extremely hard due to de-risking and over-compliance of global banks. Humanitarians have brought in over $1 billion in cash to sustain program delivery, but the liquidity and banking crisis continues to impact delivery of assistance and on the daily lives of Afghans. The Humanitarian Exchange Facility that we have discussed before, intended to temporarily and partially alleviate this liquidity issue, is still under negotiation and review by the de facto authorities. Women and girls have been pushed to the sidelines, as we have observed also in this chamber. The meager gains the country made to protect women's rights have been quickly reversed. It's been more than a year since adolescent girls in Afghanistan last set foot inside a classroom. In the 21st century, we should not need to explain why girls' education and women's empowerment are important to them, to their communities, to their countries, and indeed to all of us. Mr. President, Afghanistan is a humanitarian crisis, but it's not only that. It's an economic crisis. It's a climate crisis. It's a hunger crisis. It's a financial crisis, but it is not a hopeless crisis. Humanitarian organizations have done their utmost to provide the population in Afghanistan with a lifeline. Despite the many challenges that we have just been reviewing, UN agencies and NGO partners have mounted an unprecedented response over the past year, reaching almost 23 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. We all expanded humanitarian operations to reach affected communities in all the 401 districts of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. This was possible. This was possible because of a reduction in conflict, the introduction of cash shipments, the $1 billion that I have referred to, Mr. President, and the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2615. But of course, humanitarian aid will never be able to replace the provision of system-wide services to 40 million people across the country and the need to support those services on a sustainable basis. Mr. President, preserving basic service delivery alongside humanitarian assistance remains the only way to prevent a catastrophe even greater than we've seen these many months. Poverty is deepening, the population is still growing, and the de facto authorities have no budget to invest in their own future. It's clear to us, I'm sure it's clear to all of us, that some development support needs to be restarted. Humanitarian programming must and will continue, but the UN country team in Afghanistan, under the exceptional leadership of Ramiz Alakbarov, the resident and humanitarian coordinator, is developing its strategic framework for next year, for 2023, to address these broader basic human needs. More than 70% of Afghans live in rural areas. If agriculture and livestock production are to be protected, if they're not, millions of lives will be risked, and the country's capacity to produce food for its population imperiled. Hospitals and clinics at district and national levels must be kept running, their staff employed, and paid. Nutrition centers, preventive care must be maintained. These are all the basic services to which we refer. Outreach to financial institutions to mitigate against bank de-risking must be stepped up, and we must continue to work to ensure that girls and women are educated and employed and free to do so. The consequences of inaction in both the humanitarian and the development fronts will be catastrophic and difficult to reverse. Currently, the humanitarian response plan for Afghanistan has a gap of $3.14 billion, with over $600 million urgently required to support priority winter preparation, such as upgrades and repairs to shelter, warm clothes, blankets, and so forth. We're up against time. These particular contributions are needed within the next 3 months. In addition, $154 million is needed to pre-position supplies, including food and livelihood assistance, before the winter weather cuts off access to certain areas. The humanitarian community has indeed stayed and delivered for the people of Afghanistan and continues to do so. It's imperative that the international community, as reflected here, continues to do the same. Afghanistan's de facto authorities must do their part. Bureaucratic interferences and procedures slow down humanitarian assistance when it is needed most. Female humanitarian aid workers, both national and international, must be allowed to work unhindered and securely, and girls must be allowed to continue their education. There are many musts, Mr. President, but there are many opportunities. The path is clear and the dangers equally so. The people of Afghanistan are still there. They have shown incredible resilience over the decades and in this last year. Our task is to help them to prosper, to flourish, and to be safe. Thank you very much.
感谢
I thank Mr. Griffith for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Marcus Potzel. Again, I now give the floor to Mr. Marcus Potzel.
Thank you, Mr. President. The focus of the request for this briefing has been on the humanitarian and economic situation. And I fully endorse the comments that have been made by my colleague, Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under-Secretary General for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Since the takeover by the Taliban 1 year ago, the United Nations has remained exceptionally focused on addressing humanitarian and human needs in Afghanistan. And as Mr. Griffiths has stated, needs in Afghanistan continue to be significant. I'm scheduled to brief this same council in only a few weeks on the overall situation in Afghanistan. In addition, the Security Council will soon receive a report from the Secretary General on the situation in Afghanistan. But given this opportunity, I would like to provide a few thoughts on the current situation. First, the current regime in Afghanistan has not been recognized by any member of the international community. The reasons for that are clear. The international community has norms regarding human rights, especially those of women and girls, representative governance, and international collective security. Afghanistan is part of this international system, and the Taliban need to adhere to their international obligations, but instead request recognition based on the fact that they have secured territorial control. Second, there's no question that the sanctions against the Taliban have affected the Afghan economy since the Taliban have taken control. This has been documented in previous reports of the Secretary General, and the Secretary General has also called for measures to allow the Afghan economy to breathe. These include efforts to facilitate access to assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank for the benefit of the Afghan people, in addition to international assistance that supports basic human needs. In other words, interventions that go beyond merely providing humanitarian assistance, but support the resilience of Afghan communities. Humanitarian aid is not a long-term solution. Poverty reduction, as well as the delivery of basic goods and services, must ultimately rely on sustained economic growth. Donors have repeatedly stated that the resumption of economic cooperation hinges primarily on Taliban action to reverse regressive policies. Third, the Taliban de facto authorities are faced with a growing number of governance challenges. Discarding persistent rumors of international differences, the Taliban continue to present themselves as a unified, cohesive governing entity. The Kabul-based cabinet meets regularly, with outcomes of meetings reported publicly by the de facto authorities. However, the relationship between the cabinet in Kabul and the Kandahar-based Taliban leader Haibatullah Akhundzada remains unclear. Practices to govern by decree and through policy decisions declared to be in adherence with Islam and Afghan traditions have further curtailed fundamental human rights and freedoms, especially for women and girls, such as the 23rd March announcement of the continued closure of secondary education for girls. Today, Afghanistan is the only country in the world that denies girls the full right to education. Mr. President, the last 3 weeks have seen the highest number of civilian casualties in a one-month period since August 15, 2021, in a series of improvised explosive device attacks in Kabul, most claimed by ISIL-K. Such attacks often target specific ethnic and religious groups. We are encouraged to hear that the de facto authorities are looking into what can be done to ensure greater security for these communities. In July, UNAMA released its report, Human Rights in Afghanistan, covering the 10-month period since the Taliban takeover till 15th June this year. It reflects the human rights priorities set out in UNAMA's mandate given by this Council. UNAMA documented human rights violations targeting specific groups such as former government officials and members of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, individuals accused of affiliation with ISIL-K and the National Resistance Front, civil society, media, and women, including those accused of so-called moral crimes. UNAMA is particularly concerned about reports on action taken by the de facto officials from the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice departments that result in the verbal harassment, ill treatment, arbitrary arrests of people as they carry out their daily lives. Attacks against human rights defenders, journalists and media workers, combined with the impact of broader policy measures taken by the de facto authorities, have had a chilling effect on freedom of the media and civic activism. Last week's inaugural meeting of the Media Violation Commission is a welcome development if it indeed works to prevent further restrictions of free media space. Lastly, I would like to commend the regional response to the current situation. Afghanistan's neighbors are the most immediately affected and sometimes feel threatened by what happens in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's neighbors responded by convening meetings at foreign ministers level, first in Islamabad, then in Tehran, followed by Beijing. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation also mobilized, holding a special meeting at the foreign ministers level in Islamabad last year. Last month, an international conference on Afghanistan took place in Tashkent with the participation of a high-level Taliban delegation. Discussions focused on the importance of counterterrorism and counter-narcotic efforts, economic and infrastructure development, inclusive governance, and respect for human and civic rights. especially the rights of women, including girls' education. It is important for the Taliban to understand that neighbors, regional partners, and the wider Islamic world want them to be part of the international community. Afghanistan is a landlocked country that depends on its neighbors for access to trade routes, but is also a country with tremendous potential resources that, if properly harnessed, could benefit Afghanistan and its region as well as the wider world. Mr. President, as I have mentioned, I will have more to tell to this Council a few weeks from now on the specific situation in the country. Afghanistan itself, I believe, has not recovered from serious geopolitical shocks and interventions by foreign powers. None of these interventions have achieved their designs. All of them have altered Afghanistan in ways that were unexpected and often unhelpful. Despite immense resources expended over the past decades, Afghanistan remains significantly underdeveloped, vulnerable, and in need of international assistance. United Nations officials and UNAMA, including through its 11 field offices across the country, continue to engage with the de facto authorities and facilitate engagements between the de facto authorities, community leaders, religious groups, women and civil society, aimed to promote inclusive and participatory governance and the promotion of rights and freedoms. The Taliban have been ambiguous as to the extent to which they would wish to engage, predicated on being in accordance with their interpretation of Sharia law. It is vital to move beyond an exchange of hardened positions towards a sustained dialogue between the Taliban, other Afghan stakeholders, the wider region, and the international community. Such dialogue must place the interests of all Afghans at its center. The future stability of Afghanistan rests on meeting the needs of the Afghan people, preserving their rights, and reflecting the country's diversity in all governance structures. Let us all look ahead and improve the situation together rather than dwell on the past. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Postle for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hope you can hear me. A year on from the US chaotic and uncoordinated withdrawal of Kabul, Afghanistan verges on complete economic collapse, severe food insecurity, the rise of extremism, and fragmentation of the social order are evident. An informed insider who recently left Kabul told me last week the situation is returning to that of 1992 to 1993, when interfactional fighting turned Kabul into a battle zone with civilians caught in the midst. This rapid disintegration of Afghanistan following the departure of the international community last year is no surprise. To those paying attention, the signs of how this would all end were already visible in 2001. Incredibly, the same Western media sirens led by the BBC, which in September 2001 cheered on the military invasion of Afghanistan, telling a gullible Western public this would lead to a liberal-style democracy, by August 2021 feigned surprise that the Taliban had taken Kabul so quickly. But Taliban political influence in rural areas grew exponentially from 2003 in proportion to the broken promises, corruption, brutal militarized response, and extrajudicial killing overseen by the West. That the Taliban initially regained influence in rural areas by providing shadow governors to assist with dispute resolution and other services is testament to the carelessness of the West in Afghan matters. To know why this catastrophic failure occurred, it is necessary to understand what the main characteristics of the post-2001 Western intervention of Afghanistan encompassed. I list these as follows. Number one, impunity. The return and support of unindicted warlords by Western intelligence in October 2001 proved fatal to the state-building project. It led to knock-on effects on security, human rights, and the rule of law. Newly empowered financially, I witnessed the political rehabilitation of these Western allies at the 2002 emergency lawyer Jirga, where I was an observer. As CNN and the BBC trumpeted the lawyer Jirga as a rebirth of Afghan democracy and obsessed over images of Afghan women putting ballots into boxes, behind the scenes, the emergency lawyer Jirga was overseen by the CIA and UNAMA, with the US ambassador Khalilzad publicly humiliating and barricading participation by the beloved former king, and enabling participation of warlords and the intimidation of democratically elected candidates by armed groups and Northern Alliance internal security. The corrosive issue of impunity and its effect on rule of law and thus legitimacy, and thereby the ability to build a state, is something I focus on in my PhD. The West failed to engage with such concepts, preferring to impose its own version of the so-called liberal democracy on Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the result was a corrupt, networked state. On a supranational level, the International Criminal Court has also failed to indict any parties in relation to grave human rights abuses in Afghanistan, whether state or non-state actors. Number two, failure to support human rights. Despite promises about a new era of human rights and women's rights, the West failed to adequately fund or support the newly created Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, nor to support work on transitional justice or even truth and reconciliation, South African style. One example was the site of the Dashti Laili killings of Taliban captured by Commander Dostum in late 2001, where mass burial sites were left unprotected and the crimes unindicted because they had been committed by a Western ally. This climate of impunity further emboldened warlords to return to their fiefdoms to engage in illicit activities such as expropriation of property and children, or drug trafficking, intimidation, and murder. By 2005, when I visited NATO countries' provincial reconstruction teams, I found NATO commanders thought it appropriate to use local warlords to guard the perimeter fences of their bases. Meanwhile, local Afghans complained to me of the abuses committed by these same NATO allies and felt their concerns of no consequence to the West. People thus turned to the Taliban. Number three, military operations characterized by killing of civilians, failed intelligence, and war crimes. This included, for example, accusations that British special forces had committed extrajudicial killing of detainees in 2011, or Operation Enduring Freedom and NATO bombings of civilian gatherings, including weddings. The USA's £22,000 mother of all bombs dropped on civilians in the Shinwar region of eastern Afghanistan in 2017 exemplified the inhumanity of the entire operation. Number four, failure to understand legitimate local leadership and work with the tribal system in rural areas. And I'll just add here that at the Bonn Agreement, from the beginning, there was exclusion of many important Pashtun tribal leaders who should have been invited to the beginning of the state-building project. I'd also add that the peace plan, already prepared by Commander Abdul Haq, and which had buy-in from all sides by 9/11, was well known in Washington, D.C. and London before the events of 9/11. Abdul Haq, who was known as a brilliant commander during the 1980s war against the USSR, warned that a bombing campaign by the West after 9/11 would change the political landscape overnight, disrupting the elaborate framework of cells he had built up within the Taliban to topple the regime internally. I document this extensively in my book. Abdul Haq had also warned of the extremism being fostered in training camps and madrasas back to the early 1990s. Number five, corruption. the money-making nexus for the military-industrial complex, to extort from the US and European taxpayer, as we were warned by former President Eisenhower, General Smedley Butler, and more recently Julian Assange, has been catastrophic in Afghanistan. The human and financial costs of the war have been extensively documented by scholars at the Watson Institute, Brown University. They estimate a financial spend of some $8 trillion on the post 9/11 wars through fiscal year 2022, or some 300 million per day paid from the US taxpayer to fund the war in Afghanistan. The human costs have included indiscriminate bombing of innocent civilians. These are also documented by the Watson Institute, and of course, women and children who we were supposed to be going into Afghanistan to assist have borne the brunt of these illegitimate bombing campaigns. The US spent around $148 billion on supposedly reconstructing Afghanistan. Yet the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, has reported many instances whereby money was spent on useless white elephant projects which were simply unable to be used. These failures lead to suspicion the projects were more about recycling US taxpayer money back to military supply contractors or arms companies with links to the US political class, from Unocal to Lockheed Martin to Raytheon to Halliburton, among others. There was also failure to involve Afghans in the design and implementation of projects generally, which has of course been disastrous for longer-term viability. Huge amounts were spent on training the Afghan National Army and police force, and much focus on supplying them with US military equipment, much of which, as we know, was left behind in Afghanistan a year ago. Yet often salaries were embezzled by government officials and soldiers were poorly trained and unable to function without US air power. Again, SIGAR has documented the waste and failure of these schemes. Number 6, failure to support Afghan agriculture, which was always the heart of the economy, with 80% of the population previously directly or indirectly involved. With land, water, labor, and experience, a focus on agriculture would have been the easiest way to develop the economy, enable people to participate, and become self-reliant and food secure. One of my interlocutors says that today, Afghanistan is 50 years behind what it used to be in agriculture. It is importing citrus fruit from Pakistan when citrus was previously exported from Nangarhar, for example. With over 90% of Afghans today not having sufficient food, it is obvious that agriculture should have been a major focus. Indeed, I was shocked when working for the World Food Programme in spring 2002 to see that the FAO had just a handful of international staff present, something like 2, compared to hundreds that the WFP was employing at the time. The focus by WFP on bringing US wheat into Afghanistan has thus also enabled farmers to grow more opium, since their markets for wheat have been very distorted. The above factors indicate extreme deception about what was really at the heart of the 20-year Western occupation of Afghanistan and what prompted the sudden withdrawal. Far from building a stable state that could never again be host to terrorism, it appears the entire project was more about recycling US and NATO taxpayer monies into the coffers of private business interests. When I published my book in 2011, I naively asked an American former intelligence officer based in Geneva how the US could have managed to have failed so miserably in Afghanistan. His response was, just follow the money. For some people, this whole project has been a staggering success. He exhorted me to look at the work on the military-industrial complex by Frida Berrigan. 10 years later, with the August 2021 withdrawal, and Afghanistan left as a hulking shell with economic collapse, the rise of ISIL, and renewed insecurity, his words ring very true today.
I thank Dr. Morgan Edwards for her briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the head of OCHA, Martin Griffiths, for his assessments of the situation in Afghanistan. We listened closely to the deputy head of UNAMA, Marcus Potzel, and Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards, who worked for many years in the country in various areas and who witnessed the years of the USA and NATO intervention. Tomorrow marks exactly a year since the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. On the 30th of August 2021, the entire world saw photographs of the American Boeing leaving Kabul, with ordinary Afghans clinging to its chassis in panic. We all recall very well that this was preceded by large-scale domestic political changes, marking the beginning of a new phase. After 20 years of bloody war, the former president of the country, Ashraf Ghani, shamefully fled Kabul, and he was followed by many other Afghan political figures. The return to power of the Taliban movement in the country was entirely unexpected for everyone, including those who until recently had loudly been talking about the high level of fighting capacity of the Afghan security forces who had been trained over those years. Today's meeting may be a good opportunity to discuss the results and consequences of this ignominious 20-year campaign in Afghanistan, which cost more than 1,000 lives of ordinary Afghans and American soldiers and maimed hundreds of thousands, as well as costing $2 trillion, which could have been used for noble purposes. Incidentally, we harbor no particular illusions over this. In the last 12 months, we have all witnessed how Washington has hypocritically tried to blame the failure of its 20-year war and the current deteriorating situation on the new authorities. At the same time, as we understand, trying to cast the USA in a positive light, President Joe Biden declared that all of those objectives in the country were achieved. I recall that the Americans entered Afghanistan with a particular mission, the fight against terrorism. In actual fact, their arrival in the country only strengthened its status as a hotbed of terrorism and a center for the production and distribution of narcotics. Alongside the presence of al-Qaeda and related groups in de facto US and Western ally-controlled Afghanistan, ISIL also emerged and strengthened its influence. We've been speaking about this since 2017, but our Western partners only very recently acknowledged it. And yet, the potential of ISIL fighters this entire time has steadily been growing, including thanks to financial support from abroad and a flow of foreign terrorist fighters that have acquired fighting experience in other crisis spots around the world. The rise in drug production over these years has also reached unheard of dimensions. Before our eyes, the country has literally become a breeding ground for terrorism and narcotics, and the effective fight against those threats, as our Western allies claimed, is the reason why the United States and NATO preserved their presence there for many years. All of our calls to highlight the growing threat from ISIL in Afghanistan came up against the clear desire by Western colleagues to downplay the scale of it or to sweep it under the carpet altogether. At the same time, the United States had many opportunities, including material, military, and technical opportunities, and also time to eliminate terrorists in Afghanistan. The foreign military contingents that were in the country, however, hypocritically continued to make out as though the drug problem didn't exist at all, even though the flow of Afghan heroin at that moment had already reached many Western European countries. Over these years, there has been no answer to the repeated questions in the Council chamber about unidentified helicopters that transported ISIL fighters and their weapons to various parts of the country, including to the north, in the conditions of the full control by coalition forces over the situation, as we were assured. Quite the opposite, however. All these years, we've been hearing constantly about the Western colleagues' efforts to strengthen the fighting capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces, their effective training and control over the security situation. Against this backdrop, the socioeconomic situation in the country has remained dire. Incidentally, during the Soviet period, more than 140 enterprises were set up in the country, including industrial ones. They became the backbone of the economy and established a firm foundation for the independent, sustainable development of the country. What's more, schools were built, there were student exchanges, and requalification courses were conducted. How many enterprises, how many companies were set up during the 20 years of the NATO presence in the country? I'll give you the answer: not a single one. Quite the opposite. Billions in investments have lined the pockets of corrupt American puppets. Ultimately, the country has become dependent on outside assistance without any prospects for independent development. Particular attention should be paid to the situation of the protection of the civilian population. To our Western colleagues who prefer recently in any discussion on Afghanistan to boil the discussion down to the subject of human rights violations, we would like to remind you of the irresponsible actions of American and NATO forces that regularly launched indiscriminate airstrikes against ordinary Afghans. And that's without mentioning the nighttime raids and extrajudicial killings of civilians, including women and children. Unfortunately, despite the reports of various independent non-governmental organizations about these monstrous war crimes, to try to get justice and to hold those guilty to account, investigations have not been conducted due to the gross blackmail exerted by Washington. Any efforts to this end by the ICC were roundly squashed by the USA under the threat of sanctions. And incidentally, no one was surprised by this level of cynicism, because the American colleagues acted in the same way when it came to US war crimes in Iraq. While sponsoring the corrupt Ghani regime, the USA, behind the back of the Afghan people, conducted separate negotiations with the Taliban, which led to the signing of a deal for the withdrawal of forces from the country. Ultimately, the people of Afghanistan, who, as our American colleagues repeatedly told us they were there to protect, were abandoned to their fate. They were left face to face with ruin, poverty, terrorism, hunger, and other challenges. Mr. President, one of the most monstrous consequences of this military intervention is the large-scale humanitarian and economic crisis that has afflicted the country. According to the assessments of many experts, the current humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan could lead to a larger number of deaths than during 20 years of war. However, instead of acknowledging their own mistakes and supporting the reconstruction of the destroyed country and paying reparations, the United States and their allies plan to solve the Afghan problem in the usual way. They quite simply, using politically correct language, blocked Afghan national financial resources and disconnected the banking system from SWIFT, pushing poor Afghans to the brink and forcing many of them to sell their organs and their children to somehow make ends meet. Despite appeals from UN humanitarian agencies, human rights organizations, and Afghans themselves, the United States continue to illegally retain the foreign assets of the country under various pretexts of human rights violations and the need to pay for the September 11th terrorist attacks, which the Afghan people had nothing to do with. This irresponsible behavior by the Western coalition and their attitude to what's happening in Afghanistan are not surprising, given the formal reporting before the Security Council of the former NATO military mission, the International Security Assistance Force, which was subsequently replaced by the Resolute Support Training Mission. Against this backdrop, it is hypocritical for Western colleagues to try to continue to conduct dialogue with the de facto authorities using the language of ultimatums and the sanctions mallet, and threatening using all sorts of other forms of pressure, including limiting their ability to effectively resolve pressing issues of peace and stability with the involvement of those in the region. We also see attempts to manipulate humanitarian assistance and support, demanding that the new authorities of Afghanistan first remedy the domestic political situation and address challenges. Fiery statements about the importance of resolving the question of human rights as a precondition for everything else don't hold water. I'd like to ask you, distinguished colleagues, if because of the situation that you've created in your inaction, women and children are dying, is that not a human rights violation? Mr. President, we have repeatedly said that stability in Afghanistan is the key to peace and stability in the region and beyond. Russia has been consistent in its stance aimed at achieving a quick political settlement and national reconciliation in the country. We continue to believe that the Afghans themselves must resolve these questions. For us, what is extremely important is the reconstruction, development, and prosperity of an independent Afghanistan that is free from the threats of terrorism and drugs. We prioritize in particular political inclusivity and the upholding of human rights, including of women and girls. Achieving all of these goals is the aim of our efforts bilaterally with the de facto authorities and other Afghans, and also within the Moscow format, meetings of regional neighbors, and also through regional organizations, the CSTO and the SCO. We also provide active humanitarian assistance to the fraternal people of Afghanistan. Mr. President, we are fully aware of the new reality that has taken hold in Afghanistan. We would like to underscore that we continue to believe there is a need to ensure constructive cooperation between the international community and the Taliban. We believe that it is just this sort of dialogue that will help achieve an effective solution to the tasks of political inclusivity, the fight against terrorism and drugs, and upholding human rights, including those of women and girls. However, we are not willing to accept the attempts of our Western colleagues to simply turn the page of history of Afghanistan and to blame everything on the Taliban and to start from a clean slate, as though the last 20 years hadn't happened. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank USG Griffiths, the SRSG Potzel, and Dr. Morgan Edwards for their presentations. Since the Taliban took power by force in Afghanistan, Norway's message has been clear. The Taliban will be judged not by their words, but by their actions. So far, we have been deeply disappointed. The immediate worsening of the humanitarian and economic situation disproportionately affected women and girls. And the decision by the Taliban to ban girls from secondary education, restrict women's autonomy, access to employment and freedom of movement, and dissolve the institutions dedicated to promoting their rights have been further detrimental impact on Afghanistan's ability to stabilize and recover. We reiterate the united demand from this Council. The Taliban must swiftly lift these restrictions on Afghan women and girls. We commend UNAMA for their thorough report on the human rights situation published in July and the substantial engagement with the de facto authorities in this work. The report documents an alarming number of human rights abuses attributed to the de facto authorities, including against journalists, media workers, and human rights defenders. President, when taking power, the Taliban became responsible for the security and welfare of the Afghan people, and they have not delivered. Millions of Afghans need humanitarian assistance. Earthquakes, drought, floodings, food insecurity, and lack of access to basic services are adding to their plight. And winter is quickly approaching. The imposed restrictions by the Taliban on women's autonomy, employment, and movement impede the ability of women to both deliver and receive life-saving assistance or generate income with which to pay for food and basic services. The knock-on effect on the population as a whole is dramatic. Norway is concerned by continued reports of interference, discrimination, and corruption hindering the delivery of humanitarian assistance to those in need, in particular internally displaced persons, minorities, and women-headed households. President, children continue to be the most vulnerable. As documented in the recent SG report on children in armed conflict, Afghanistan is among the countries with the highest numbers of grave violations against children. There is also an increasing risk of terrorist groups strengthening their foothold in Afghanistan. Frequent terrorist attacks continue to target and kill civilians. The expectations of this Council are clear. Afghan territory must not be used to threaten or attack any country or to shelter or train terrorists. President, the Afghan people deserve sustainable peace. They deserve a legitimate government that represents all Afghans. Sustainable peace means not just the end of violence or war. It also requires an end to human rights abuses and discrimination. Norway stays committed to the people of Afghanistan, and we will continue to support the basic human needs of Afghans, and we will do our utmost to help address the economic crisis. To do so, we must continue to engage and meet with the de facto authorities. We must hold them to their commitments. They bear the main responsibility to protect the civilian population and to respond to the humanitarian and economic crisis in Afghanistan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank U.S. Chief for Humanitarian Affairs Martin Griffiths and the Deputy Special Representative Marcus Putzel, and we followed very closely the briefing provided by Dr. Lucy Morgan-Edwards. My country expresses solidarity with the Afghan people. The situation in Afghanistan is of concern to my country, particularly because of the ramifications and the impact on peace and security throughout the region and beyond. As you know, when the Taliban took power, political inclusiveness has remained sorely lacking. The diversity of the Afghan people is scarcely represented. Minorities, ethnic, geographic, political, social, as well as women, remain outside the political process. The frequent violations of fundamental freedoms, an increase in attacks by armed groups opposed to the Taliban, an uptick in terrorist activities, primarily by Al-Qaeda and Daesh, and growing opiate trafficking paint a frightening picture, and the international community must therefore act as one to relieve the suffering of the Afghan people. We take this opportunity to express our deep concern at the series of explosions which have led to 250 deaths and casualties this month, and we firmly condemn the attack on the 17th of August against the Abu Bakr Mosque in Kabul. We call upon the de facto authorities to increase their efforts to combat terrorism and to protect the population, which is their responsibility. Stabilizing Afghanistan involves bolstering trust, promoting a transparent and participatory government, as well as establishing structured political dialogue between the Taliban and all Afghan stakeholders. The impact and positive role of women in society is evident, and we therefore encourage the de facto authorities to lift their restrictions on this important segment of the population. Mr. President, for a year, the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan has been exacerbated primarily because of the paralysis of the banking institutions, the weight of international sanctions, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the impact of climate change, in particular a harsh drought and significant flooding. We are saddened by the plight of some 4 million internally displaced persons. Women and children, once again, are the frontline victims of this three-pronged economic, environmental, and humanitarian crisis because of their exclusion, the removal from schools, forced marriages, and even bartering. Given the rigid stance of the Taliban regime, which prefers to impose increasing restrictions rather than respecting the commitments to the international community aimed at improving the living conditions of their people, we must not lose sight of the fact that the fate of millions of people depends on mobilizing funding. We therefore call on donors to continue to promote efforts towards humanitarian aid. In conclusion, I reiterate Gabon's full support for UNAMA and for OCHO and their efforts on the ground. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon and now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I'd like to thank USG Griffiths and Mr. Potzel as well for their briefings. And we've also taken note of the briefing provided by Ms. Morgan-Edwards. This afternoon, I will address 3 points: the humanitarian situation, the condition of women and girls, and the scourge of terrorism. As we've heard, the tragic reality facing millions of Afghans is bleak. Humanitarian needs far exceed the capacity of the international community to provide support to a country where 24 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Some remote communities are even experiencing near-starvation conditions. As USG Griffiths said, the effects of climate change have exacerbated this critical situation. The heavy rains this month have impacted thousands of families, causing dozens of deaths. Given this situation, it is essential to guarantee unfettered humanitarian access. We make an appeal to avoid any interference in the distribution of humanitarian aid and to allow women to participate in these tasks and not to change the list of recipients. Moreover, necessary measures must be taken within and outside of Afghanistan to ensure that the transfers of resources to finance humanitarian work can actually reach those in need. Mexico reiterates the importance of ensuring that no coercive measure have a negative humanitarian impact. Turning to the situation of women and girls, we regret the backsliding which has taken place over the past year. Contrary to some promises, the Taliban have passed more than 20 edicts restricting the rights of women and girls. Physical gender-based segregation, restrictions on freedom of movement and dress, and unfathomable return to practices such as forced marriages, including child marriage and honor killings. Not allowing women to work limits the purchasing power of families. These restrictions, in turn, minimize the possibility of generating income, and therefore they fuel the vicious circle of poverty, hunger, and discrimination. We call for an end to the exclusion of women in the labor market. Similarly, we regret the decision to suspend secondary education for girls. An entire generation of girls will not finish their schooling. The Taliban is jeopardizing the possibility of Afghanistan overcoming the economic and humanitarian crisis by using these measures which limit the participation of women and girls. In addition, we are dismayed at the incidents of extrajudicial killings, the violations of the freedom of expression, association, and other basic human rights, which are reflected in the UNAMA report. As the international community, we have the responsibility not to allow a further deterioration of the situation of human rights for all Afghans, including women, girls, and minorities. Mr. President, terrorist attacks in recent months are clear proof that the threat of terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan is real and latent. The majority of the attacks carried out by ISIL-K target ethnic and religious minorities in their places of worship or in schools. Mexico unequivocally condemns these attacks. Given the critical humanitarian situation plaguing Afghanistan, I would conclude by appealing to the international community, in particular to donor countries, to continue to make financial contributions or to provide humanitarian protection to Afghan nationals, as my country has done for more than 600 people. Similarly, we call upon the de facto authorities immediately to reverse any decision restricting the public life of women and girls, to respect human rights, including the rights of minorities, and not to allow Afghanistan to become once again a refuge for terrorists. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me thank USG Griffiths, DS RSG Potzel, and Dr. Morgan Edwards for their briefings. And let me start by offering condolences to Pakistan following the devastating flooding in their country this week. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And as my Minister Lord Ahmed has said, we are working with the Pakistani authorities to establish the support and assistance they need. The United Kingdom stands with the people of Pakistan at this time of need. President, Russia has called for this meeting 1 year after the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan. And as we reflect on that anniversary, we should also recall the legacy of the Soviet Union's 10-year occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 until 1989, that created the conditions for devastating civil war and the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. Today, it is clear that the situation in Afghanistan remains critical and the needs of the Afghan people acute. As we have heard, over 24 million Afghans are in need of humanitarian support, and nearly 20 million are facing acute food insecurity. Economic stability and the delivery of basic services are essential to end the cycle of suffering in Afghanistan. There remains a vital need to inject liquidity into the country to avoid economic collapse. While UK personnel have left Afghanistan, our commitment to the Afghan people remains resolute. Between April 2022 and March 2023, the United Kingdom committed $676 million in aid to Afghanistan. Our Foreign Secretary co-hosted the UN Humanitarian Pledging Conference earlier this year, raising $2.4 billion. By contrast, Russia contributed nothing to the UN Humanitarian Response Plan. China pledged $2 million. On top of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, the human rights situation is stark. There are credible allegations of extrajudicial killings and detentions and disappearances, including civil society activists and former security forces and government officials. The last few months have also seen the imposition of deplorable restrictions on the rights and freedoms of women and girls, including on access to education, jobs and services, and on their freedom of movement and dress. It is clear to all but the Taliban that the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in society is a prerequisite for a stable, prosperous Afghanistan. The Taliban have also been repeating other mistakes from the past, not least the harbouring of the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in downtown Kabul in breach of their international commitments. We again call on the Taliban to meet its commitments, to ensure principled, unhindered humanitarian access across the country, to uphold basic human rights, most pressingly for women and girls, and to ensure Afghanistan is never again a permissive environment for terrorist groups. Strong and consistent UN leadership remains crucial to ensuring a well-coordinated and prioritised response, and UNAMA has our full support in delivering its mandate provided by this Council. President, 1 year ago, this Council adopted Security Council Resolution 2593, which set out our shared expectations of the Taliban. We hope the Council can continue to speak with one voice to press the Taliban on its commitments and to support the Afghan people in overcoming the challenges ahead. We thank the UN for their ongoing and tireless efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Mr. President, I thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths, Deputy Special Representative Potzel and Dr. Morgan Edwards for their briefings today. 2 weeks ago we marked one dreadful year since the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan. 1 year on, the Taliban have proven that they have not reformed. They have shown the same unjust and cruel behaviour of the past, using repression and fear. Fundamental freedoms have been severely curtailed, Afghanistan's once vibrant civic society and media landscape violently suppressed. Those who raise their voices in opposition, including women protesters, are met with intimidation, arbitrary arrest and detention, and enforced disappearance. Human rights defenders, activists and journalists remain among the most at risk. The Taliban have sought to render women invisible. They are quite literally being systematically wiped from public life. Banned from most places of work, subject to onerous restrictions on when they can leave their home, Afghan women are living a nightmare. Despite international condemnation, the Taliban continue their draconian assault on human rights. The vacuum left by Afghanistan's Independent Human Rights Commission, dissolved by the Taliban in May, makes robust international monitoring all the more important. Support for the work of UNAMA's Human Rights Service and the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan is essential. Mr. President, The past year has been one of unconscionable hardship for the Afghan people, with economic collapse spurring one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. Over 19 million people remain food insecure, with children suffering the most. Afghanistan now has the highest number of people in emergency food insecurity globally, and the health system is on the brink of collapse. Overwhelming humanitarian need has been compounded by natural disasters, most recently devastating flooding in central and eastern Afghanistan. We applaud the work of UN agencies and humanitarian organisations on the ground who have stayed and delivered in the most challenging of circumstances, preventing a spiral into widespread famine. The preservation of the humanitarian space is an overarching priority for Ireland across the sanctions regime. In this regard, we, therefore, strongly supported the adoption of Resolution 2615 in December, providing a humanitarian exemption to sanctions imposed under the 1988 Taliban sanctions regime. Such efforts to provide clarity and facilitate the provision of much-needed humanitarian aid are essential, and we support the introduction of licences to further aid delivery. However, as a result of the Taliban's policies, dire humanitarian need remains. So too does the imperative to find solutions to relieve the effects of economic collapse. We must also be clear on the solutions that lie within Afghanistan. Economic recovery is impossible while half of Afghanistan's workforce are confined to their homes, denied economic opportunity. Any future economic growth is impossible without girls graduating from high school. Mr. President, last August we sat in this chamber and insisted that the international community would now have to address the consequences of not heeding the many warnings of Afghan civil society. Despite repeated assurances in the weeks following their takeover, the Taliban has shown utter contempt for their commitments made to the Afghan people and to the international community. They vowed to respect the rights of women. Instead, women have been forcibly and systematically excluded from public life. They promised that girls would return to school. Instead, girls have spent 345 days banned from their classrooms. They promised to counter terrorism and to combat terrorism. Instead, we have seen frequent attacks against the Afghan people, particularly minorities, and evidence that al-Qaeda continue to operate with the full knowledge of the Taliban. The international community and this Council cannot stand by in the face of such disregard for international law and the principles which underpin our common commitment to humanity. Mr. President, we owe it to the Afghan people to listen, to heed their warnings and to act. Ireland stresses again the importance of including Afghan civil society in this chamber. The international community must demonstrate its solidarity with the Afghan people, holding the Taliban to account. Last August, we shared our view that the Council must be prepared to consider further measures from the toolbox at our disposal. This includes revisiting broad-based privileges that were granted to the Taliban for the purposes of pursuing peace and security. On the basis of what we have seen to date, we cannot and should not take a business-as-usual approach. Thank you.
Okay. I thank the representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil welcomes the delegations of Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Pakistan to this meeting. I thank the briefers for their informative contributions. I would like to extend to both Afghan and Pakistani people our condolences for the lives lost during the floods that have hit their countries. The recent destruction adds to the extremely concerning humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. It is likely that, as happened last year, the approach of the colder months heralds a further deterioration in living conditions. The continuous engagement of the international community with Afghanistan remains a matter of life and death for millions. It is painful to note that a year after the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghan territory, some of the worst expectations about the country's future have been confirmed. This is particularly true about the scourge of terrorism. The month's attack on the Abu Bakr Mosque in Kabul clearly illustrates how precarious security conditions are. Brazil offers its solidarity to the families of the victims and reiterates its condemnation of terrorism in all forms and manifestations. Women and girls remain relegated to the status of second-class citizens. Faced with increasing restriction to access to work and education. Despite the condemnation by this Council of discriminatory measures taken by the de facto authorities, there are no signs that the Taliban are willing to review their positions. The expectations regard an inclusive government with the participation of women and minorities remain a distant goal. Half of the Afghan population is denied their dignity by the leaders of their own country. In the aftermath of the withdrawal of foreign forces, the Brazilian government established a policy of humanitarian visas for Afghans threatened by the crisis in their country, with particular focus on women and girls. To date, more than 5,000 humanitarian visas have been issued, allowing Afghans to find an opportunity to rebuild their lives in safety. Mr. President, although the prospects for engagement with Kabul are not encouraging, we remain convinced of the need to foster dialogue with de facto authorities. We have in mind the words of Ambassador Deborah Lyons, who, as the head of UNAMA, reminded us that the Taliban, which only a year ago was an insurgent force, is in transition to become a government. In this stage, technical contacts that can be of benefit to the local population and to the provision of services should be considered. We regret that the Council could not reach consensus on renewing expectations to the travel ban for some of individuals listed by 1988 committee. We fear that the impossibility of Afghan leaders traveling abroad will delay the country's reintegration into the international community. The Taliban's first experience in power before 2001 military intervention left an important lesson. Isolation will not lead the group to moderate its positions. Preventing its leaders from traveling is not a punishment for misbehavior, but a measure that limits the possibilities for constructive and pragmatic engagement. Mr. President, this Council should not lose sight of the greater goal of improving the living conditions of the Afghan population. The continuity of dialogue is an essential condition to allow for Afghans' development and abbreviate the suffering of its people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the USG Griffiths and Mr. Potzel for their update and listened carefully to the account from Ms. Edwards. A year has passed since the return of the Taliban to power in Kabul, a long year that by all counts has been disastrously lost. The overall situation, as we heard, in the country is critical. It is going through one of the worst humanitarian crises, and what USG Griffiths presented needs no further comment. The economy is in free fall, and in 1 year, the Taliban have managed to shrink it by 1/3. No surprise that human and drug trafficking are on the rise. Mr. President, as if the economic, the humanitarian, the man-made and natural catastrophes were not enough, Afghanistan continues to suffer from terrorism. The presence of the al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul confirms fears expressed repeatedly here on the persisting and pervasive ties between the Taliban and transnational terrorist groups. We call on the Taliban to denounce terrorism in all its forms and to cut ties with terrorist organizations. Mr. President, Afghanistan is today one of the worst places to be a woman. Contrary to their promises, the Taliban are undoing decades of progress in empowering women in the Afghan society. They have forced women into silence. They have deprived them from their legitimate role in society, and they've made them invisible from the public place. Young girls are forced out of school, the only country in the world to impose such shocking measures, and girls are forced into early marriages. Women are starving and have lost their access to their hard-earned rights, education, and jobs. And with the Taliban, life in Afghanistan has lost its colors. Oppressing half of the population is the shortest path to perpetual misery and obscurantism. It most brutally tramples on the basic norms of rights and dignity. We should not accept such an aberration to continue, or worse, gain support. Afghan women and girls need our help more than ever. We call on the Taliban to change their course, take steps to lift restrictions on women and girls, respect their human rights, and meet the expectations of the Afghans and the world to permit their full, equal, and meaningful participation in work, education, and public life, as well as freedom of movement and freedom of speech. These are critical prerequisites for long-term peace, stability, and development of the country. Mr. President, the unfolding and worsening Afghan tragedy presents a daunting challenge even for a united and responsive international community. The de facto rule of the Taliban lacks legitimacy. They have given no indication to be capable of dealing with any of the existential challenges facing the Afghan people, except for letting them get worse or actively making them worse. Such disarray will only fuel resistance, create tensions, and lead to violence. We welcome any help and support to the Afghan people in these dark times, and we strongly support UNAMA's work and that of the NGOs present in the country under such challenging conditions. We stand with the Afghan people in their demand for equal rights in conformity with Afghanistan's obligation under international law and reiterate our call on the Taliban to respect them. It is a fact that Taliban are in charge. They must know that the decisions they have made so far are punishing Afghans, are isolating the Taliban further from the international community, and make them the only responsible for sending the country spiraling into abyss. They are and will be judged by what they do. It is not very difficult to understand, even for the inexperienced Taliban. You cannot pretend to move forward by walking backwards. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and Deputy Special Representative Ponzel, for your briefings. Mr. President, colleagues, I'm glad this meeting was called today, not for the reasons the Russians requested it, but because the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is grave, as we heard from UN briefers, and requires our attention. Flash floods, earthquakes, avalanche, droughts, and terrorism have made a desperate situation more dire. The global food insecurity crisis, exacerbated by COVID, climate, and conflict, has been felt acutely by the Afghan people. You heard the statistics Undersecretary Griffiths outlined, describing what he calls a relentless layer of crisis. The Taliban have failed to provide for the Afghan people. In fact, they have done just the opposite. The Taliban's policies repress and starve the Afghan people instead of protecting them. The Taliban's exclusion of outside voices mean that the people who would contribute toward alleviating the suffering from these crises are not allowed to help. Among the Taliban's most egregious actions has been its repression and abuse of women and girls. The Taliban have denied women the opportunity to work, a decision that is both unjust and economically perilous. In Chicago last week, I met with an Afghan refugee who had found a new life in the United States. But he's kept up at night knowing his wife is still there. She was educated, engaged in the private sector, and contributing to her country. Now she's secluded in her home. Equally egregious is that girls have not been allowed to return to school. This is both a moral problem and an economic problem. UNICEF estimates the Afghan economy would gain $5.4 billion if the Taliban let girls go to secondary school and join the workforce. On top of that, the Taliban's proclamation that it would be best for women to simply stay at home if a male chaperone can't accompany them means that nearly all female-headed households in the country aren't getting enough food to eat. Instead of looking to the international community for help with these crises, the Taliban harbored the leader of al-Qaeda in downtown Kabul. How can they expect to build a relationship with the world when the Taliban provides safe haven to those who seek to do harm to us all? And I do mean all of us. And in recent months, the Taliban have even made the delivery of humanitarian assistance more difficult. They continue to interfere with the delivery of critical assistance that the Afghan people desperately need. The Taliban has increased taxes on critical assistance, and it fails to protect humanitarian aid workers. All of which to say, the Taliban are not providing for the Afghan people in their time of need. But the United States will not give up or look away. We're determined to help the Afghan people. We've worked to assist the Afghan people multilaterally through the UN and this council. Last year, we led this council's effort to unanimously adopt a resolution which established a carve-out for the delivery of humanitarian aid for the Afghan people. And we have strongly supported the work of the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. We supported extending its critical work this past March. Its good offices, outreach, and human rights reporting continue to be invaluable. And we have also worked bilaterally to help the Afghan people directly. The United States is the world's leading donor in Afghanistan. This last year alone, we have provided more than $775 million in humanitarian assistance directly to the Afghan people and Afghans in the region. And we're proud to be the largest funder of UN operations in Afghanistan. We've also issued 7 general licenses to enable economic activity for the Afghan people. And we are supporting efforts to protect, preserve, and facilitate access to approximately $3.5 billion in Afghan central bank assets for the benefit of the Afghan people. Let me be clear, no country that is serious about containing terrorism in Afghanistan would advocate to give the Taliban instantaneous, unconditional access to billions in assets that belong to the Afghan people. The countries that have rolled up their sleeves and tried to engage with this issue, like ours, have seen how the Afghan central bank was hollowed out long ago. It does not have a credible anti-money laundering system in place. It does not have a credible system for combating the financing of terrorism, and it does not have an independent monitor in place to verify improvements in capacity through technical assistance. So the Afghan central bank on its own cannot currently conduct responsible monetary policy. Fortunately, there is one reason the Afghan currency has held stable, because major donors, including the United States, have generously contributed well over $2 billion in humanitarian assistance and basic needs programming to the country since last August. Today, we've heard Russia say this is not sufficient. Russia argued, as others have in the past, that Afghanistan's problems are the fault of the West and not the Taliban. Really? Here's my question. What are you doing to help other than rehash the past and criticize others? If you're concerned that Afghan women and children are dying, how are you helping them? Russia has contributed only $2 million to the UN Afghanistan Humanitarian Response Plan to date, and Russia has contributed nothing, not 1 cent, nothing this year. China's contribution have been similarly underwhelming. If you want to talk about how Afghanistan needs help, that's fine. But we humbly suggest you put your money where your mouth is. In the meantime, the United States, along with other partners and allies, including many on this council, will continue to diligently do everything we can to support the Afghan people. We will continue providing humanitarian assistance. We will continue supporting UNAMA. We will continue to be a champion for Afghanistan's women and girls. We will continue to do everything we can to help the mothers and daughters, the fathers and sons, the people of Afghanistan who deserve so much. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking USG, Martin Griffiths, and Mr. Marcus Potzel for their briefing, as well as the briefing received from Ms. Lucy Edwards. Today's briefing provides us yet another opportunity to assess the situation in Afghanistan. We remain deeply concerned by the situation in Afghanistan, especially the condition of women, girls, and minority groups. We are appalled by the deliberate policies of the de facto authorities to effectively remove women from Afghan public life, with no woman representation in government. Today, over 14 million Afghan women and girls have lost their right to go to work, to go to high school or university, and their freedom of movement. Women and girls in Afghanistan need the support of this council and the international community to preserve their rights and to hold the Taliban to their earlier promise that women will be able to exercise their rights within Sharia law, including being able to work and study. After decades of war, recurring natural hazards, chronic poverty, drought, widespread food insecurity, coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, these have resulted in millions of Afghans being in need of humanitarian assistance. We note the urgency in meeting the humanitarian pledges made during the flash appeal for humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan, and believe that this council can play its part by urging support from donors for the humanitarian agencies to scale up their interventions to bring much-needed relief to the vulnerable segments of the population who are currently bearing the brunt of the harsh living conditions and need to develop resilience to re-establish sustainable livelihoods. Ghana expects that the de facto authorities on their part will act in good faith and align themselves with global efforts to bring lasting relief to Afghan citizens. In this regard, we acknowledge the untiring efforts of UNAMA and other international organizations who continue to provide critical support on the ground. We are deeply concerned by the security situation and senseless killings in Afghanistan and urge the de facto authorities to stabilize the situation and desist from arbitrary arrest, detention, tortures, extrajudicial killings, and collective punishment, and the targeting of members of ethnic, tribal, and religious groups on mere suspicion. We are, however, encouraged by the hesitant efforts at reconciliation as expressed through the amnesty extended to rival groups who abstain from fighting the Taliban and efforts to reach out to former enemies. We nonetheless deplore Afghanistan becoming a permissive environment for terrorist groups and militants and providing bandwidth to meet and plan attacks. In this context, we remind the de facto authorities to be mindful of their obligations under international law and to ensure that they do not collaborate with terrorists to make Afghanistan a safe haven. We also call on all regional countries to help address the security and other challenges confronting the country, taking into account their proximate interests. Mr. President, the Taliban need to understand that this council and the international community is prepared to act in a manner that will further constrain them should they continue on the course that they have chosen. In conclusion, we urge the Taliban to stop all forms of discrimination and immediately remove all restrictions in place in order to give all Afghan citizens equal rights to participate freely in civil and civic life. We urge the authorities to channel their energy on rebuilding the economy of the country for the benefit of the Afghan people, which is one of the cardinal purposes of government. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, thank you. I also thank Mr. Griffiths, Mr. Potzel, and Ms. Morgan Edwards for their briefings. This month of August marks a sobering anniversary. Slightly more than a year ago, Afghanistan sunk into chaos. Since then, the humanitarian situation has continued to deteriorate. Afghanistan is now among those countries in the world experiencing the worst food crisis, with nearly 20 million people affected, 6 million of which risk sliding into famine. Afghans, in particular Afghan women, are no longer able to exercise their most essential rights and freedoms. Those responsible for this situation, as we know, are the Taliban. Their forceful seizing of power, as well as all of their decisions since then, have brought Afghanistan to the brink. The expectations of the international community were nevertheless clearly laid out in Resolution 2593, which was adopted a year ago. That resolution outlined the essential prerequisites for the stability and reconstruction of the country and recalled the obligations stemming from conventions ratified by Afghanistan, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Despite the Taliban's systematic failure to respect their own commitments, the international community has continued to reach out to help the population and to leave the door open for dialogue. France has played its full role, along with the European Union, in these efforts. Without delay, we responded with a contribution of 123 million euros since last September. The European Union has disbursed 335 million euros since 2021. The Security Council also adopted Resolution 2615 to facilitate the delivery of assistance to the Afghan people and to prevent any misappropriation. But we must remain vigilant. The Taliban are choosing isolation, and far from accepting the outstretched hand, they continue to flout their commitments, as illustrated by the ban on girls accessing secondary education. Faced with grave human rights violations, which are growing in number, we must acknowledge that the international community cannot trust its interlocutors. Respect for human rights, and in particular the rights of women, cannot be a variable. It is a principle that is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Women and girls in Afghanistan who have been deprived of all their rights are prisoners in their own country. In the face of their dramatic situation, we cannot allow any room for impunity, and we cannot allow ourselves either to provide development assistance which would strengthen the Taliban in their human rights violations. The recent neutralization of the al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri is another example of the Taliban not keeping their promises. This is a success for the fight against terrorism, but it also confirms our fears, which we have expressed many times in this room. The Taliban continue to shelter and support terrorist groups, in particular Al-Qaeda. 5 conditions must be met by the Taliban in order to emerge from isolation, and I'll restate them here. The ability for Afghan men and women who want to do so to safely leave the country, free access for humanitarian assistance across the country, respect for the fundamental rights of all, in particular women and girls, the formation of a representative government, and the total and real breaking of links with terrorist groups. Currently, none of those conditions have been met. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate France's full support for the Afghan population. as well as France's willingness to participate in the efforts needed to alleviate their suffering, and its full cooperation with the United Nations and UNAMA. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of France. Now I give the floor to the representative of the UAE.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, I would like to thank Russia for requesting this timely meeting to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. I also thank our briefers, USG Griffiths, Deputy Special Representative Potzel, and Dr. Morgan Edwards for their briefings. A full year has passed since the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan and the Taliban's capture of Kabul. During that time, we have seen the conditions for ordinary Afghans deteriorate, with a growing number of people facing starvation and lacking access to many basic services, including healthcare. Over the past year, we've heard heart-wrenching accounts of the catastrophic humanitarian situation. Afghanistan is now the only planet on Earth where girls cannot attend high school and where the fundamentals of a dignified life are systematically denied to women. At the same time, the international community and the Afghan people were promised that Afghanistan would be placed on a path to stability and peace, and this has not been the case so far, as confirmed by the presence of Al-Qaeda's most recent leader, killed last month in Kabul, and a series of attacks by Daesh Khorasan. The alarming security situation appears to be worsening rather than stabilizing. Of course, challenges existed in Afghanistan before the onset of the worst food security crisis the world has seen in a generation, which is hitting the already vulnerable Afghan population very hard, with more than 90% of Afghan's population struggling to meet basic food needs. UNAMA has been and will continue to be a crucial partner in addressing these critical challenges and in managing the international community's relationship with the Taliban. We're therefore concerned that more than 2 months have passed without an appointment of a successor to Special Representative Lyons, and we commend her tireless efforts in that role. We urge a swift appointment and the Council's full engagement with the UNAMA mission. Mr. President, I want to elaborate further on the worsening situation of women and girls in Afghanistan, which remains profoundly troubling. Our fears about the Taliban reversing the gains made in women's and girls' empowerment over the past 2 decades have unfortunately materialized. On this issue, there is agreement around this council table. We have all rejected the restrictions imposed on women and girls and the erosion of their access to equal opportunity. This is not a question of competing priorities or cultural or religious norms. Ensuring women and girls can participate fully, equally, and meaningfully in all aspects of life is part and parcel of what is required if Afghanistan is to progress into the 21st century, and that must remain a mainstay of the Council's demands. The security situation also continues to be fragile, and countering extremism and terrorism remains a top challenge. Reports by the Secretary General and the monitoring team clearly state that the threats posed by Al-Qaeda and Daesh Khorasan remain of concern. We recall this Council's clear and repeated demand that the territory of Afghanistan not be used to shelter or train terrorists. The UAE calls on the Taliban to live up to their commitments to combat terrorism and for the Council to use the full tools at its disposal to ensure that this is the case. The UAE is also very concerned that the economy of Afghanistan continues to be in freefall. The economy has shrunk by 20 to 30% in the past year, according to World Bank estimates, and the humanitarian indicators continue to worsen. Although the humanitarian carve-out from the 1988 sanctions regime, which the Council agreed to, was necessary to relieve some of the pressure, it did not and could not address the desperate need for liquidity, access to banking services, and the central bank's core functions. These are all building blocks that need to be in place to incentivize economic activity and lead to recovery. We recognize that there are difficult and significant policy issues and constraints at play here, but we urge a redoubling of efforts by all those involved to come to an agreement to restore the essential operation of Afghanistan's economy. The UAE is ready to play its part to contribute to such efforts. Mr. President, the UAE has been clear-eyed about these challenges for the past year. The basic question of how we move things forward, however, remains unanswered. The international response cannot be the isolation of Afghanistan. Calibrated engagement with the Taliban needs to be maintained, and shutting off communication channels with the de facto authorities will not yield results in any of the areas where the international community would like to see progress. But we do need a coordinated strategy, and that is alarmingly absent from our deliberations today. We also want to highlight that Islamic countries have a special role in relation to engagement with the Taliban to help promote religious and cultural dialogue, respect for diversity, and the elimination of discrimination. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, alongside other regional organizations, has been playing an important role in this respect. The UAE, as a member of the OIC, stands ready to contribute to a renewed effort for stability and prosperity in Afghanistan and for its people, as we have done over the last 5 decades with over $2 billion in humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, since August of last year, we have witnessed the emergence of seismic global political and economic challenges to our international system. We cannot let ordinary Afghans pay the price of increasing global polarization. In the case of Afghanistan, identifying our common ground and speaking with a single voice should not be beyond the countries in this chamber. The UAE will continue to work with all Council members to ensure a constructive approach to the challenges facing Afghanistan in the coming period. We need to keep our focus on this goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates and now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
President, I wish to begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths, the Deputy SRSG for UNAMA, Mr. Markers, and Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards for their briefing. Kenya stands in solidarity with the people of Afghanistan for their unflinching quest for peace, justice, and progress. We have watched their unparalleled resilience in the face of formidable challenges. Apart from protracted conflict that has ravaged millions of lives and livelihood, the people of Afghanistan have suffered many other man-made and natural calamities. Only recently, floods claimed over 180 lives and destroyed thousands of houses. Earlier in June, a devastating earthquake claimed over 1,000 lives. In addition to these are other climate change-induced insecurity, as well as rising global food prices. All these have conspired to cause an overwhelming humanitarian situation that the already constrained humanitarian assistance programs cannot meet. As the winter season approaches, we call on the international community to urgently step in and support the over 23 million Afghans in need with all the necessary assistance. Mr. President, sadly, a year since the Taliban seized power, the people of Afghanistan are no better than they were before. If anything, they are worse off. It is the collective responsibility of the international community and the obligation of the Taliban to create a better environment for the people of Afghanistan to govern themselves and determine their social and economic progress. Time has come for the international community to consider ways of engaging with the Taliban, to articulate practicable near-term policy objectives to rebuild Afghanistan economy and social fabric. The end goal should be to align humanitarian aids and other forms of development assistance to achieve economic recovery and sustainability to reduce aid dependence. In this regard, the engagements could include how to ensure that Afghanistan frozen assets are deployed in a structured manner with a clear monitoring mechanisms to help the ailing economy. But these engagements should, in our view, be predicated on the Taliban committing in word and deed to 2 fundamental imperatives. First is to uphold the rights of millions of Afghan people without any discrimination to gender, age, ethnicity, or religion. They must, in particular, accord women and girls equal rights and opportunities as their male counterparts in all aspects, including access to education, employment opportunities, leadership roles at all levels, and freedom of association and movement. We expect the Taliban to engage women at all levels and incorporate their voices into mapping out non-discriminatory policies that address challenges facing the country. Second, Mr. President, the Taliban must disassociate with listed terrorist groups and ensure that Afghanistan is no longer a base for such terror groups as the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda to launch attacks in Afghanistan and further afield. On its part, the international community, especially members of the Security Council, must be motivated by the interest of the people of Afghanistan when engaging on this matter. It is concerning that the major powers continue to pull in opposite directions as they use the deteriorating situation to advance their own interests at the expense of the well-being of the millions of Afghans. To conclude, we reaffirm our unwavering solidarity with the people of Afghanistan and stand ready to support all endeavors aimed at securing their safety and well-being. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya and now give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, allow me to thank the delegation of Russia for requesting this meeting today. This provides us with an opportunity to take stock of the situation prevailing in Afghanistan. Let me also thank the briefers for their presentations. As we have repeatedly stated at the Security Council, India has direct stakes in ensuring the return of peace and stability, given our position as a contiguous neighbor and long-standing partner of Afghanistan, as well as our strong historical and civilizational linkages to the Afghan people. In response to the humanitarian needs of the Afghan people, as well as to the urgent appeals made by the United Nations, India has dispatched several shipments of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. These include 32 tons of medical assistance in 10 batches, which includes essential life-saving medicines, anti-TB medicines, and 500,000 doses of the COVID vaccine. These medical consignments have been handed over to the World Health Organization and to the Indira Gandhi Children's Hospital in Kabul. India has also dispatched over 40,000 metric tons of wheat to Afghanistan so far. To ensure fair and just distribution of India's wheat assistance, the government of India has signed an agreement with the UN World Food Programme for the distribution of wheat within Afghanistan. In order to closely monitor and coordinate the efforts of various stakeholders for the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance, and in continuation of our engagement with the Afghan people, an Indian technical team has also been deployed at our embassy in Kabul. Our approach to Afghanistan, as always, will be guided by our historical friendship and our special relationship with the people of Afghanistan. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to reiterate our firmly held conviction that humanitarian assistance should be based on the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. The disbursement of humanitarian aid should be non-discriminatory and accessible to all Afghans. In particular, assistance should reach the most vulnerable first, including women, children, and minorities. Mr. President, India was the President of the Security Council last August when Security Council Resolution 2593 was adopted. The resolution set forth the expectations of the international community in clear and objective terms. These included ensuring that the territory of Afghanistan is not used to launch terrorist attacks against other countries, formation of a truly inclusive and representative government, combating terrorism and drug trafficking, and preserving the rights of women, children, and minorities. The same message has been reiterated in subsequent resolutions, including the most recently adopted Resolution 2626. With these benchmarks in mind, the present situation is indeed one of concern. On terrorism, the recent findings of the 1988 Sanctions Committee's analytical support and the Sanctions Monitoring Team report indicate that the current authorities need to take much stronger action to fulfill their anti-terrorism commitments. There is a significant increase in the presence of ISIL-K in the country and their capacity to carry out attacks. ISIL-K, with its base reportedly in Afghanistan, continues to issue threats of terrorist attacks on other countries. The series of attacks at religious places of the minority community, including the recent attack at the Sikh Gurudwara on 18 June in Kabul, followed by another bomb explosion near the same Gurudwara on 27 July, is hugely alarming. The linkages between groups listed by the UN Security Council, such as the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as well as provocative statements made by other terrorist groups operating out of Afghanistan, pose a direct threat to the peace and stability of the region. We need to see concrete progress in ensuring that such proscribed terrorist entities or their aliases do not get any support, tacit or direct, either from Afghan soil or from the terror sanctuaries based in the region. On the political front, India continues to call for an inclusive dispensation in Afghanistan, which represents all sections of Afghan society. A broad-based, inclusive and representative formation is necessary for both domestic and international engagement. We also express our concern at developments in Afghanistan which directly impact the well-being of women and girls. We join others in calling for the protection of the rights of women and girls and to ensure that the long-fought gains of the last 2 decades are not reversed. Mr. President, peace and security in Afghanistan are critical imperatives that all of us need to collectively strive for. India will continue to play its role towards the pursuit of that objective. The interests of the Afghan people will continue to be at the heart of our efforts in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. Colleagues, I thank the Russian Federation for its initiative to hold this meeting, and I thank USG Griffiths, DSRSG Potzel, and Dr. Edwards for their briefings. Exactly a year ago, Kabul was going through the most surreal moment. Foreign troops hurriedly evacuated from the airport. Explosions echo outside the airport. Civilians fell from military planes that were forcibly taking off, and soldiers shot innocent civilians. The world was shocked to see all this kind of chaos. A 2-decade-long war ended in panic, chaos, and ignominy. Looking back on these 20 years, we cannot help but ask, what did this war bring us? This war, waged in the name of counterterrorism, did not eliminate terrorist forces in Afghanistan. Instead, terrorist activities became more and more rampant, and terrorist forces such as ISIL continue to grow. This war claimed more than 200,000 lives, including 50,000 Afghan civilians, more than 60,000 military police, and thousands of foreign soldiers. It has left millions of people homeless and displaced. Behind every lost life is a family in anguish. Another 20 years might not be sufficient to heal their wounds. This war, waged under the banner of democratic transformation, did not bring peace, stability, and prosperity, but rather left behind a fragmented and shattered country. Although foreign troops have withdrawn, the impact of war is still ongoing, and Afghan people are still suffering from various consequences. The fiasco of the past 20 years has once again proved that military intervention and power politics are not the right way. Foreign models and democratic transformation cannot win the heart and mind of the people, and the tragedy in Afghanistan should never be allowed to repeat. China has always stressed that the withdrawal of foreign troops is not the end of responsibility, but rather the beginning of reflection and correction. The countries concerned should have seriously reflected on their mistakes and corrected them in a timely manner instead of walking away with a shrug of shoulders. Regrettably, rather than fulfilling their due responsibilities, relevant countries have cut off development aid, frozen Afghan assets, and imposed political isolation and blockade. This is not only just evading responsibility and abandoning the Afghan people, but also perpetuating their mistakes and exacerbating the sufferings of the Afghan people. What's more perplexing is that we do not see any reflection in humility nor mistake correction with sincerity. On the contrary, what we heard is malicious accusations against and attack on others. Colleagues, with the withdrawal of foreign troops, the Afghan people have an opportunity to truly take control of their own destiny. The past year has seen the Afghan interim government in action and significant improvement of the security situation. The interim government has promoted political dialogue and recently held a new Grand Lawyer Jirga. At present, so many things cry out to be done in the country, and its peaceful reconstruction faces multiple challenges, and the country still has a long way to go. We expect the Afghan interim government to pursue sound and inclusive domestic and foreign policies, actively safeguard and improve people's livelihood, resolutely combat terrorism, and live in harmony with all countries, including its neighbors. The international community should support Afghanistan in advancing its peaceful reconciliation, restoring public services and market activities, and engaging in regional and international economic and trade cooperation. The international community should enhance its engagement with the Afghan interim government in a rational and pragmatic manner. Since 2019, to facilitate dialogue on peace and stability in the country, the Security Council has, based on U.S. proposal, decided to grant exemption to the travel ban for some Taliban personnel. From the very beginning, this was not a reward to anyone, nor a bargaining chip in negotiations on other issues. Regrettably, however, certain Council members now oppose the extension of the exemption, citing Taliban's failure to live up to its commitment on women and girls' rights. There is no doubt that the rights of Afghan women and girls should be guaranteed, and we expect efforts by the Afghan government in this regard. At the same time, linking the two issues is unreasonable. Ending exemption will only close the door to dialogue, exacerbate antagonism and division, and it will never achieve the desired effect. We call on the countries concerned to take a constructive stance by supporting the extension of the existing exemption. As we learned from the briefings, at present, the humanitarian situation in the country is grave, and the survival and development of tens of millions of people, including women and girls, are worrying. Many women and girls have no food nor clothing, and some families even rely on selling organs and children to survive. Without food, survival is out of the question. Then how do you expect girls going to school or even women taking part in political life in such circumstances? It is ethically hypothetical and practically deadly to vow for the rights of Afghan women and girls while slashing humanitarian and development aid to the country and stubbornly maintaining unilateral sanction against the country. The current humanitarian and economic predicament faced by the country is resulted from the lack of liquidity and economic stagnation caused by foreign sanctions. Afghanistan's overseas assets belong to the Afghan people, and freezing these assets is tantamount to depriving the Afghans of their life-saving money. We have noticed that more than 70 renowned scholars published an open letter earlier this month calling on the United States to immediately return the frozen assets in full, pointing out that splitting the frozen $7 billion is arbitrary and unjustified. Once again, we urge the United States to return these assets to Afghanistan in full without delay and conditions. Colleagues, as the largest neighbor of Afghanistan, China has always firmly supported its peace, stability, and development, and we have been making huge efforts in this regard. Since last winter, the Chinese government has provided emergency assistance of 300 million yuan to the country and imported more than 1,400 tons of Afghan pine nuts through the air corridor of pine nuts, helping the Afghan people, including many housewives, to increase their revenue. Apart from contributing to the UN response plan for Afghanistan, China will follow through on the announced bilateral aid of 1 billion RMB, and we will actively expand economic and trade cooperation with Afghanistan and promote the country's integration into regional cooperation. China has always delivered on its promise of assistance that benefits Afghan people and reflects equality and mutual respect. We urge the international community, especially the countries responsible for the war, to take concrete actions to continue helping the Afghan people, not to abandon them or punish them. Afghanistan needs the help of the international community, and the world also needs a peaceful and stable Afghanistan. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, from the various assertions of our American colleague, I did fish out a call for Russia and China to spend more on the reconstruction of Afghanistan. That is to say, the United States and their allies are paying for everything, and the Russian Federation and China are only whipping up hot air. The cynicism of those assertions is stunning. We are being asked to pay for the reconstruction of a country whose economy was essentially destroyed by 20 years of US and NATO occupation. That is to say, instead of acknowledging their mistakes and trying to remedy them, we are now being reproached for not wanting to pay for to settle other people's accounts. It's a very original proposal. But that is to say that for quite a long time now we've not been surprised by anything. No, gentlemen, our former Western partners. You are the ones who need to pay for your mistakes, but first of all, you need to return to the Afghan people the money that has been stolen from them. We have helped and will continue to help Afghanistan, and we recommend that you focus on settling your accounts with the Afghan people for 20 years of thoughtless occupation that have destroyed Afghanistan and that have left its population on the brink of survival. And not everything is measured in monetary terms. The lives of those killed during your thoughts about democracy in Afghanistan, rather, that is to say, the military campaign, cannot be measured in monetary terms, nor can you buy the loyalty of the Afghan people, a loyalty which the United States has lost once and for all. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the United States.
Mr. President, I'll be brief. Let me just state that if the Russian Federation believes that there was an economy in Afghanistan to be destroyed, it's been destroyed by the Taliban. And also let me be clear that the United States has not turned our backs on Afghanistan. We have remained in the country. We have continued to provide essential assistance to the Afghan people, and we're working closely with the international community, with partners to support the establishment of mechanisms that will protect, preserve, and disperse on a limited basis Afghan central bank assets for the benefit of the Afghan people. But I also want to be clear that we will not turn these funds over to the Taliban to be used for their purposes that do not contribute to the well-being of Afghans. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the U.S. for her statement. And now, according to Rule 37 of the Rules of Procedure, I give the floor to the representative of Afghanistan.
Mr. President, allow me to thank you for convening this timely briefing on the humanitarian and economic situation in Afghanistan. I wish to thank Undersecretary General Mr. Martin Griffiths and Mr. Mark Spotzel, Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General, and Dr. Lucy Edwards for their presentation and their calls of urgency to the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. Mr. President, we are discussing the situation in Afghanistan after 1 year since the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan by force. As we heard in the briefing by Mr. Griffiths, Afghanistan is going through one of the worst social, political, economic, and humanitarian crises at a global level. The people are being impacted by combined impact of multiple natural and man-made catastrophes, such as floods, poverty, unemployment, internal displacement, and migration. Women and girls constituting half of the population are deprived of their legitimate rights and are being systematically erased from social and public life. The doors of secondary schools for girls are still closed. Our youth remain hopeless about their future. Afghan citizens from diverse religious and ethnic groups remain highly vulnerable. Professionals and educated people, as the human capital, are unemployed, dismissed, or forced to leave the country. In addition, there are credible reports of detaining, torturing, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearances of former security forces, journalists, human rights activists, protesters, and civilians accused of having links with resistance forces in Baghlan, Panjshir, and Tahar provinces, as well as collective punishment and forced displacement in these provinces by the Taliban. In general, the outlook for a secure, stable, and prosperous Afghanistan is bleak and opaque. Mr. President, the good news is that compared to previous years, there has been a noticeable decrease in the level of civilians' casualties, an increase in the national income resources, and a sharp decrease in corruption. However, the Taliban authorities, de facto authorities, have failed to earn national and international trust and have not fulfilled their commitments on core issues, including the reopening of girls' schools, respecting fundamental human rights of all citizens, particularly of women and girls, and establishing an accountable, functional, and inclusive system to effectively address the current crises. Instead of placing Afghanistan on a path to economic development and self-sufficiency, the Taliban continued consolidating their rigid ruling and imposing restrictions on citizens and monopolizing their power through convening and gatherings of religious scholars. The current situation has triggered discontent among the people and increased civil and military resistance against the Taliban. In addition, there are credible reports about the presence of regional and international terrorist groups in Afghanistan, raising concerns that Afghanistan might once again become a safe haven for terrorism and extremism. The recent multiple terrorist attacks by ISIL-K-P and the killing of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul city are testimony to this fact. What happens today in Afghanistan will not stay in Afghanistan. To address these common threats and challenges, there is a need for collective and genuine cooperation by all stakeholders, Afghan people, including the Taliban, regional and international partners. On behalf of the people of Afghanistan, I would like to reiterate our call for a national dialogue to break the current impasse and provide the people of Afghanistan with an opportunity to discuss and agree on core issues through a framework or a roadmap for formation of a representative and inclusive system. I want to stress that only inclusive, accountable, and functional system based on the will of people, rule of law, and justice involving professionals and credible people from all backgrounds and with good reputation, including women, can save Afghanistan from the current humanitarian crisis, ending the cycle of war. This cannot be achieved without the support of the United Nations as a credible and legitimate organization to engage actively with all stakeholders and formulate a pathway to peace, stability, and prosperity in Afghanistan. While we wholeheartedly appreciate the work and efforts of the UN in Afghanistan, we demand a stronger role and further engagement of the United Nations beyond humanitarian assistance. In this context, we call on this Council and all international partners to support and facilitate intra-Afghan dialogue and a comprehensive political roadmap that can guide all the relevant efforts towards an inclusive, stable, and prosperous Afghanistan. I would like to express our appreciation to the members who spoke before and reaffirm their commitment to supporting the people of Afghanistan, particularly the women. To ensure aid effectiveness and aid delivery to the vulnerable people who desperately need them, there is a need for establishing a transparent and accountable mechanism to oversight and report on humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. I want to highlight that humanitarian assistance is only short-term solution, and Afghanistan needs development assistance under a transparent system which should include, among other conditions, full transparency on budget execution. We also appreciate the neighboring and regional countries for continued efforts to engage through hosting conferences and issuing statements in support of Afghan people, including Afghan migrants and refugees. Mr. President, I call on the Taliban to protect and respect the fundamental human rights of all citizens of Afghanistan, without prejudice based on gender, ethnic, and religious identity. This includes reopening girls' schools and restoring of women's full human rights, honoring their amnesty announcement, immediately ending detainment, torture, and forced displacements and extrajudicial killings of former security civilians, and bringing perpetrators of these acts to justice. These acts are violations of international human rights and international humanitarian laws, as well as Islamic values and principles. Afghanistan is the home for all citizens who have peacefully lived together for thousands of years, and there is no minority or majority. We need inclusivity in social, political, and economic development of our country. Mr. President, in conclusion, my plea from this Council and all regional and international partners is to have a united stance and a cohesive approach in your engagements on the issue of Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan have immensely suffered from the protracted conflict and imposed wars. We hope that this Council stays fully engaged in support of Afghan people and act based on the principles and mandate entrusted by the UN Charter in ensuring peace and stability in Afghanistan. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Afghanistan and now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, I thank Russia for requesting this important meeting, and thank you, Mr. President, for convening the meeting. I also thank the briefers for their insightful briefings. Just a year after the irresponsible withdrawal of foreign forces and the Taliban's takeover, Afghanistan is now dealing with a number of interconnected and overlapping crises. The humanitarian situation is particularly dire. Around 25 million people are now living in poverty, with many who go hungry. Prolonged drought is also exacerbating food insecurity, and human rights continue to be violated, particularly against women and girls who are still denied access to education. Meanwhile, the de facto authorities have yet to fulfill their international obligations. This catastrophic situation entails responsibility and obligation for those foreign forces that illegally invaded and occupied Afghanistan under the guise of fighting terrorism and left nothing but devastation in their wake. It also serves as a reminder that military intervention in other countries under the pretext of combating terrorism while claiming to bring democracy, peace, and prosperity not only degrades those common values but also harms those states and their people. Against this backdrop, I would like to emphasize the following points. The international community should continue to support Afghanistan, particularly in terms of the provisions of humanitarian and development assistance that has been critical in keeping the Afghan people alive, maintaining basic services, and bolstering the economy. We call once more for the return of frozen assets belonging to the Afghan people. This is critical in assisting the Afghan economy and saving lives and should not be politicized or conditional. The Taliban must heed the international community's repeated calls for the formation of an inclusive government that accurately reflects Afghanistan's multi-ethnic society. An inclusive government is the only way to ensure and protect the rights of all Afghan people, including women and girls, as well as linguistic, racial, and religious minorities. Despite repeated international calls, the Taliban has failed to make significant efforts to ensure that the government is truly ethnically and politically inclusive. The formation of an inclusive government is a prerequisite and critical component for international recognition. New reports on the resurgence of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliated groups in Afghanistan are alarming, particularly in light of the recent spate of terrorist attacks across the country that have killed and injured more than 250 people this month, with the most recent attack on a mosque in Kabul on 17 August, resulting in at least 54 casualties. The emergence of terrorist groups could pose a serious threat to Afghanistan, its neighbors, the region, and beyond. This trend highlights the international community's ongoing demand that the Taliban must commit to fighting terrorism and ensure that Afghanistan no longer serves as a safe haven for terrorist organizations such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda. The security, stability, and prosperity of Afghanistan are intertwined and inseparable from those of its neighbors that have legitimate interests and immediate and grave concerns for Afghanistan's overall situation, particularly in its security, as well as significant capacity to bring peace and prosperity to the country. The UN, particularly the Security Council, must use this capacity in order to improve Afghanistan's current deteriorating humanitarian situation and ensure the country's long-term peace and development. We support UNAMA's efforts to promote peace and stability in Afghanistan in accordance with its mandate. The United Nations can play a vital role both in addressing Afghanistan humanitarian crisis as well as facilitating the intra-Afghan political process. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran continues its efforts to assist the people of Afghanistan and work with Afghanistan neighbors and other partners to ensure durable peace and suitable development in Afghanistan. We believe that an Afghanistan that is democratic, prosperous, stable, and free of war, terrorism, and drugs benefits its people and is in the best interest of all of its neighbors, the region, and the world. We must all work tirelessly and collectively to help achieve this goal while fully respecting Afghanistan's territorial integrity, unity and political independence. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me congratulate you on a very successful presidency this month. I would also like to express my gratitude to those delegations who've expressed their condolences at the devastating floods in Pakistan. I also thank USG Martin Griffiths, Deputy SRSG Podsel, and Ms. Edwards for their briefings. We are grateful also to the Russian Federation for calling for this meeting and for you for convening it. This is a timely discussion on Afghanistan 1 year after the withdrawal of foreign forces and the Taliban's takeover in Kabul. Mr. President, it can be said of this long war, as of all wars in Afghanistan, that it could not have been won and should not ever have been fought. The withdrawal of foreign forces was inevitable. The important issue was what was left behind. A comprehensive political solution among all Afghan parties and between them and the foreign presence would have been the best way to end this 20-year conflict. Unfortunately, despite the efforts made, especially by Pakistan, such an outcome proved elusive. The Security Council, Afghanistan's neighbors, and the international community are obliged to deal with the realities in Afghanistan, not with subjective perceptions and desires. What could not be imposed by force is unlikely to be secured by sanctions, asset freezes, or travel bans. Regardless of the ideology and internal policies of the Afghan interim government, the primary interest of the international community, of Afghanistan's neighbors, especially Pakistan, is the restoration of sustainable peace and security in Afghanistan. This implies, first and foremost, avoiding another civil war. It would be irresponsible for anyone, neighbors or not, to encourage and sponsor any insurgency or any terrorist group in Afghanistan. Secondly, it is vital to continue humanitarian and economic assistance to Afghanistan in order to avoid another civil war, arrest the rise of terrorist groups like Daesh, prevent economic collapse, a humanitarian crisis, and another refugee surge from Afghanistan. Even as Pakistan and its people grapple with the devastating impacts of the unprecedented floods that are ravaging my country, we urge the international community to fulfill the UN Secretary General's call for $4.2 billion in humanitarian assistance and economic support to the people of Afghanistan. Pakistan's help to Afghanistan will continue. Similarly, we call for the release of all of Afghanistan's frozen national reserves and the creation of effective mechanisms for their disbursement to and use by the Afghan people. Without such support, economic collapse and chaos may be the consequence. The early resumption of reconstruction and implementation of the shovel-ready connectivity projects with Central Asia and other neighbors, including the extension of the China-Pakistan economic corridor to Afghanistan, can consolidate economic stabilization in Afghanistan. Mr. President, we are disturbed by the disagreement within the Council on the resumption of the travel ban exemption for the 13 Taliban leaders. We hope this does not signify a geopolitical divergence on Afghanistan between major powers. This would have serious implications for Afghanistan and the entire region. The isolation of the Afghan interim government is not in the interest of either the Afghan people or the international community. While we appreciate the frustration of many governments with the non-fulfillment of early promises made by the Taliban on girls' and women's education, human rights, inclusivity, and counterterrorism, isolating the Kabul leadership is unlikely to persuade it to change its policies, much less its ideology. It is only through sustained engagement that we can advance the objectives of the international community in Afghanistan, that is, respect for human rights, political inclusivity, and counterterrorism. Despite the difficulties, Pakistan believes that the Council, the international community, and UNAMA should develop a clear pathway to advance these three objectives. Pakistan hopes that the new SRSG will be appointed soon and hopes that UNAMA's constructive engagement with the interim government will be maintained. We agree with the representative of the United Arab Emirates that the OIC has a special role to play in developing such a pathway towards normalization. We have presented the OIC's views to this Council previously. On human rights and girls' education, the OIC countries will seek to make an advance inter alia through conversations between the Taliban and delegations of Islamic scholars and ulama. Pakistan has initiated such exchanges. We are hopeful that progress can be made through this process. Similarly, the OIC, as well as Afghanistan's neighbors, hope that progress can be made on the issue of political inclusivity. Perhaps in the first instance, this could be promoted at the functional level. Any encouragement of dissident groups can reverse the efforts to promote political inclusivity and reconciliation. Mr. President, for Pakistan and for most of the international community, the greatest concern is to prevent terrorism from and within Afghanistan. We expect the Afghan interim government to prevent Afghanistan's territory from being utilized for terrorism against neighbors or any country. In particular, eliminating the threat posed by ISIL-K, Daesh, the TTP, ETIM, IMU, as well as Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups is of vital importance. Pakistan will support all sincere efforts by the Afghan interim government to neutralize and eliminate these terrorist groups while fully respecting Afghanistan's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Certain spoilers, however, who wish to encourage terrorism against Pakistan from Afghan soil must be vigorously dissuaded. Their objectives are focused on a strategic advantage against Pakistan and its friends. We will resist them vigorously. In response to its cooperation on terrorism, human rights, and political inclusivity, it is natural that the Afghan interim government desires reciprocal steps, including humanitarian, economic, and financial assistance, early removal of sanctions, and eventual diplomatic recognition. These steps must not be perceived in Kabul as being a bridge too far. It is only through continued engagement and mutual accommodation that peace and security will be restored in Afghanistan. Pakistan will continue its endeavors to this end within the format of Afghanistan's 6 immediate neighbors, plus Russia, within the OIC, with UNAMA, with the European Union and other friendly countries, and, if so desired, within the platform of the Troika plus Pakistan. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.